Bien, vamos con un poco de retraso, un poco bastante. Ese retraso ha ido creciendo progresivamente, pero creo que es interesante que no debemos perder la oportunidad de tener al menos un breve debate y que comentéis las intervenciones que ha habido y discutamos pues, sobre aquellos puntos que os parezcan más interesantes. Si queréis podemos hacer como hemos hecho antes y los que habéis intervenido en esta última sesión podéis venir a la mesa porque imagino que la mayor parte de las preguntas irán dirigidas a vosotros. Sí. Yeah, Stefanos had to go, but Robert, Marcel, Manalee.
I can make some comment on, I particularly the issue of what is vernacular and what isn't. I always take the view that if you say you're doing something vernacular, then you're not, because it's something that you do without self-consciousness. But this is neo-vernacular is not vernacular, it's new vernacular. So I think that to pick up vernacular as a style is problematic because it stops being vernacular. In fact, you could say that classical architecture is the vernacular turned into a style. Just don't say yes.
This one, is it? Well, does this work? I don't know. Does it work? Yeah, it's a debate I'd rather not get drawn into, I think. It's a very difficult one. I've personally got a lot of problems with the term vernacular. I'm not too keen on it at all, really, simply for the reason that I think it does set up these kind of black and white polar distinctions. And in effect, I have the same problem, I think, with the term traditional architecture, because I think that is doing exactly the same thing as well. I think we're polarizing things too much in the sense of this is traditional, this is modern, this is vernacular, this is not vernacular. Whereas in actual fact, I think, the world is much more complex, much more intertwined, much more difficult, really, to understand than in such simple polarities. But I'm also conscious that as an anthropologist, in anthropology the term is not used, vernacular architecture, it's a very architectural discourse term. So I'm conscious that, if I'm editing an encyclopedia of vernacular architecture, I'm not going to challenge the term, it's going to make it too difficult. Because ultimately you might say everything is vernacular or nothing is vernacular.
The other one about tradition is that it's people think it's something fixed. It's not. It's something that is constantly evolving. And not all traditions are good. Slavery was a tradition. It's not good. And there are many others. But it's something that is not static. I think that is the important thing.
Yeah.
But the key is it doesn't deny the past. I think the denial of the past is the problem.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that when tradition loses its adaptability is when it's really dead and it disappears. So the key of tradition is its ability to adapt itself to the new times and the requirements, the evolving requirements of the society.
I think Paul Oliver has been mentioned a few times, right? I think what he wrote was there's no such thing as traditional architecture. There's only architecture that embodies traditions. If you look at it like that, then in fact all buildings, whether you call them traditional or modern, embody traditions in the way of use, in the materiality, in the technology that's employed, in many aspects. So I think that would be my perspective, probably, as an anthropologist, that there isn't such a thing as traditional architecture, there isn't such a thing as vernacular architecture, there's architecture, and it embodies traditions, but in different ways.
Well, there are two things. I think that the term means built by slaves. Verna means slave. But there are two aspects. One is that vernacular architecture is not animal architecture. Animals build buildings without thinking. They are programmed to do it and they don't reflect on it. And they do the same over billions of generations. Whereas peasants, when they built, in traditional ways, they were thinking, and they had an aesthetic sense. What is different today is that the same processes happen, for instance, in South America, all the vernacular, or in India, vernacular architecture is spontaneously built. Half of Chandigarh used to be a vernacular building. 1 story high with thatched roof, and you thought it was medieval. There were the builders who built the concrete buildings, lived in vernacular buildings, but they were thinking when they were doing this. The difference comes really with vernacular building, whether it's done to do a house or whether it's done to do temple artwork. That is one. The second really fundamental difference is whether you do it with natural materials, whether the natural materials come from 1,000 miles, they're always local, or whether you do it with synthetic materials. And there we don't have experience. And that is why, most, for instance, in Guatemala, which I know well, the villages are all built in concrete. They are absolutely awful. They are fantastic. I mean, people live well there. They're 1 or 2 story high buildings. They are very ugly, but they paint them in all colors, and they are really, they are vernacular, but because there's little experience with concrete material, they take any shapes. Or in India, it's fantastic concrete vernacular. I did hundreds of drawings of backsides of vernacular buildings, concrete buildings in India. Incredibly interesting. The fronts are all kitsch Palladian copies of temples and European classicism. The backs are incredibly inventive. But vernacular is always done by people who think.
Of course.
Because you can't do a vernacular building with natural materials without intellectual discipline.
We also can't be a human being without thinking.
Well,
in one form or another. I mean, to a degree.
It's a form of intellectual endeavor, whether you have accomplished it yourself, but if you try to do something different, it doesn't work, it will collapse.
But in a linguistic sense, I think actually the origin of our use of the word vernacular is a linguistic one. It was in vernacularum. If you look at something that's written in Latin, they'll say at the bottom in vernacularum, which means in the local language, in the local speech.
Yes.
The one tradition, I think, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. You can create a tradition. Anyone can create a tradition. Actually, in legal terms, in some countries, it means it has to have persisted for 3 generations. In other words, the generations vary according to what it is. There's a university in America that didn't have any freshman ceremonies. I can't remember which one it was. They didn't have any. So they decided to create them, so they picked them up from other universities. And because university generations are about 4 years. So within 12 years, people believed they'd always been there. But the point about it is it's not so much creating traditions is easy. It's who they are traditions for. So you and I, Leo, can create any traditions we like. Between us, we can form a little group and create a tradition. And that's fine, but traditions belong to communities. And it's which community they belong to. So in a way, modernism can create traditions, and it does, and then the term is commonly used. But those traditions are exclusive to a very small group of people. The key is not whether there are traditions exist, it's to whom the traditions belong.
But arguably, of course, the classical tradition is there as well. It's also quite an exclusive group of people. I think for me, I always get asked this question, right? What is vernacular architecture? I don't really have the answer. I always say, if you tell me what architecture is, then I can tell you what vernacular architecture is. I fully agree that, of course, people who we see as designing and building vernacular architecture, of course they think of, they design, they build, they do everything that architects do. It's only the architects that say that they are vernacular builders. It's not themselves. They themselves just build their dwellings, their homes, their temples. So I think it's the definition of what an architect is or what architecture is that is the real problem. Not what vernacular architecture is. Vernacular architecture came into being because if this was architecture, this exclusive activity, then what is everything else?
It's just like, as I say, it's like when you say it is, it isn't.
Yeah.
Hello. I just wanted to add a little thing I think we missed, is when we talk about vernacular, we talk about a collective intelligence and bottom-up intelligence. So when Nanavati was presenting this graphic of training coming from masters of techniques, telling people how to do, I missed the arrow coming back up, because where we know, what we know comes from these people doing it along ages and evolving along ages.
That's right, but I think the misconception is that vernacular or traditional architecture is not always perfect, is not always the best solution. Most of it is, but sometimes it also fails. So for example, in Sindh, when this earthquake came, all these circular houses, some of them could not survive. And in Pakistan, there was a flood immediately after the earthquake. So the entire belt, I think something like 60,000 to 70,000 houses, it was all gone. And that's when they realized that it is not the vernacular architecture as it is. The community should not build the same thing again and again. Some change is required. So that's where this whole role of architect came in. What I said at the last slide about what Oliver says, enabler. So it is the expert skill. So Yasmin Lari, the chair of the foundation, she just designs those changes in the structure. That, you know, you need to strengthen the corners, or you need to lift it up because the flood level is rising. And all those changes are due to climate change. Those parts were never flooded earlier, but now they are frequently. So you constantly need to keep evolving those things, and that's where I think your knowledge comes into picture.
Is it constant evolution?
Yes, it is. It is
as
constant.
We said, and vernacular is dynamic and is adapting every
Of course
time.
it is.
So what is not conserving is because it's updated. It's not updated. So what I think is just the arrow should go back up, and to make it dynamic,
it's a cycle. Yes.
evolution needs revision, and you can participate in this revision, but with the people, as you said. That's at least what I think of vernacular.
Can I just add that I don't think that vernacular architecture is some sort of collective wisdom. I think that is part of the myth of vernacular architecture, that distinguishes the architect from all the others. Because in many vernacular contexts, there are people that act as an architect. So I'm most familiar myself with Indonesia. There are master builders, or we call them master builders, who take on the role of designer, contractor, builder, religious expert. They do everything and they work with the local community, but they take charge. They are not RIBA accredited architects with a diploma. But they are definitely seen to be the master builders, the architects in their society. And I think people like to think that, you know, because it is vernacular architecture, because it isn't architecture, therefore there can't be any architects. But that's Rudowski's, you know, myth, which is a very annoying one, I think. Architecture without architects, because it's not without architects. There's a huge diversity of people dumped into that category of vernacular architecture. If you're in a traditional hunting-gathering society, maybe there are no building experts, but in most societies there are those that have more knowledge, skill than others, and that take the lead, I think.
It was in the 19th century that the arts and crafts movement objected to the professionalization of architects.
Right.
Because the idea that architects were not, instead of being apprentices, they should become professionals, they regarded as a retrograde step. Because it created them into superior intellectual beings, as a contrary to people who learnt on the job. Yeah. That was a very strong feeling in Britain in about 1880, 1890, but of course in countries like, in countries that had the Beaux-Arts tradition, they were turning out architects who were intellectuals. And certainly an archaeologist friend of mine is of the view that The big mistake with architecture is taking it into universities, because universities want you to be obscure and intellectual, and that actually you gain credit from that, whereas learning on the job is quite a different matter. But I do think there's one thing that comes out of, you know, whatever we call vernacular, whatever we call traditional, which you and I, and we have, and we're kind of debating, is the key thing that it evolves.
Yeah.
And the key thing is none of these things are static, and they evolve. It's how, you know, it's how they evolve, and how satisfactory they evolve, and how, and equally well, social mores and social attitudes evolve too, and these things have to evolve together to be successful. Without context. Agreed.
Well, I'm sorry for those of you who want to continue the discussion. We can leave it for tomorrow or for after this, so you informally can follow up. Thanks to you all for participating in this session. To all attendees, to all speakers, and I hope to see you tomorrow again in basically the same schedule with 2 sessions in the morning, and we will continue dealing with topics which are again related to placemaking and traditional architecture, building, and urbanism. And again, you are all welcome to our debates tomorrow. Thank you.